All right. Thank you again. Lovely piano. Okay, am I on? Okay. Honestly can't tell at this point. So, I want to start off just coming from a point of complete and total honesty that this was a really difficult sermon for me to prepare and to just kind of do. And it was difficult not because the subject matter was hard, but because I kind of realized this last 2 weeks that God and I have a very similar sense of humor, that whole made in his image thing. Because, as many of you probably know, I teach 7th grade. And 7th graders are wonderful 90% of the time. But there's always that 10% where one of them's like, this is boring. I could do a better job than you could. And I'm like, you want to trade places? I'm game. And so they'll come up to the front and I'll go sit in their seat. And I say trade places very specifically. Because the moment they're like, all right, open your books too, I just start heckling them. Boo, this is boring. What are you doing this weekend? Phones. And they're like, really? And I'm like, how's it feel? Mm-hmm. And so I say that because today I'm talking about the peculiar institution. And if anyone has read an 8th grade social studies textbook, you know that I'm talking about slavery, which is weird. So the reason this is a similar sense of humor thing is because for years, when anyone in any church I've ever gone to has talked about slavery, on the way home, I complained to her that they did it wrong. Her being my wife, this person over here. Because I saw people like, who's he talking about? She does exist, as hard as that may be to believe. But I complain because when people talk about slavery, they always put it in the context of pre-Civil War America, post-Columbian exchange, slavery. And that's not what it was. Roman slavery was vastly different. And so I complain that they're not actually getting the passage right because they're not talking about the very basis. I realize if you're filming, I need to stand much more still than I am, so I will work on that. But Tim sent me, I'm going to stop jumping all over the place now. Tim sent me the verses. He's like, here's the ones you can talk about, or you can do whatever you want. And the verses out of Timothy are that weird end portion where they talk about slavery and how slaves should behave towards their masters. And I'm like, Tim, there is no way I can do a sermon on this. And God kind of had that finger like, you've been asking for this opportunity for 5 years. You can't weasel out of it now. And I'm like, and you can't be mad because it's God. So you're like, all right, fine. And so I spent the better part of this week like, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I can do it. And then I'm like, you were the person who did a 5-week sermon series on biblical themes in the album Destroyer by Kiss. You can handle one sermon on slavery. And I did. It was great. So, in Timothy, I'm actually not just talking about that slavery portion. As it shows on here, it doesn't show there. I'm going to be talking about 1 Timothy 5, 22 through 6:2. It's about 5 verses, and they don't make any sense put together. They're just, I call them the postscript verses, because in these books, Timothy, Corinthians, Romans, they're all letters that Paul or another writer, because they're debated, are sending to Christians or specific people who wrote them. They're like, oh, Paul, I'm struggling with this and this and this. What do I do? And we just have the responses. So we kind of have to backtrack through what did they say to figure out what is the problem they're addressing. And so in these postscript verses, it gives us actually a really good idea of what the church he was talking to was like. My grandpa was a pastor in Mount Blanchard. Does anyone know where Mount Blanchard is? All right, we got 5 hands. That's the most I've ever gotten because that town is tiny and pointless. So yes, in Mount Blanchard, there is a Nazarene church, and my grandpa pastored there. And he told my dad once that the big questions are not what defines a church. It's the little questions you get asked in passing that really shows what the people are like. And so the people of this church asked about 5 specific things. So the first one, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, and do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. I'm actually going to read them all and go back to each one. Stop drinking only water, and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. The sins of some men are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, even those that are not cannot be hidden. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters are not to show less respect for them because they are brothers. Instead, they are to serve them even better, because those who benefit from their service are believers and dear to them. These are the things you are to teach and urge on them. That is a random mix of like 5 things. But if we really break down where they're coming from, it shows us that this church is one of the first to really grapple with how do we apply what Jesus said after the fact. Timothy is debated as being whether it was written by Paul, because it's dated much, much later, when the church itself was actually being established and people were really looking into the teachings of Jesus, not from people who were like directly there. People don't think Paul actually wrote this letter, but it was someone else who either had a similar name or was just attributed to him. So the first one, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, and do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. I've been to churches that do a lot. It's like every other week they're like, oh, come on, we're going to anoint someone, we're going to lay on hands. It's a big thing. In other churches, it like never happens. I'm not sure if I've ever seen it happen here in Bluffton. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it's not as common of a thing. But in some places, though, people really ask for that faith healing. Like, oh, can we come up? Can you lay hands on us? Can you do this? Can you do this? And some people believe that doing it all the time, like, cheapens it. And so these people are asking, should we lay hands on every single sick person? Should we, wait till it's dire? And he's like, look, don't overdo it. If you feel like it's necessary, do so. But again, pray about it. It's kind of up to you. Stop drinking only water. Use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. This is still a big one people are wrestling with. Because we could probably do a show of hands across the room, like who here are teetotalers and never drink because the Bible says so, who drinks some, whatever. At the time, is anyone here familiar with how clean water in Rome was? Only hand, second hand. Drinking the water in Rome, just like out of a tap, was a lot like drinking tap water in Mexico, to give you an idea. And so that's why people drank wine all the time. It's like, oh, breakfast, wine, lunch, wine, dinner, good wine. Because if you drank the water, you'd get sick. So you cut your water half and half with wine. The alcohol would kill all of the infectious, gross stuff. So these people who read in the Bible, don't be drunkards. And like, we're just going to cut out wine entirely. Not going to do it. And the writer's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. He said don't drink in excess. If you're getting sick, have a little bit. If it's for the good of your person, so you can continue to not be dead, have a little bit. The sins of some men are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not cannot be hidden. This is a thing, all of these things I like talking about because it's still stuff we see challenging the church today. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If it's social media, I've had one at some point because I can. And you always see those people who are like, hey, check out this selfie of me and this homeless guy I gave $5 to. And they're like, oh, I'm such a good person. We're like, oh, you're such a good person. You're giving money to the homeless. And they're constantly posting about all the good things they're doing. And a lot of people are like, that kind of defeats the purpose of doing good deeds if you're just doing it to show that you're a good person. And so these people are like, we're doing good deeds and no one's really noticing. Like, what's the point in doing good deeds if no one's seeing it? And he's like, look. Yes, you're doing good deeds. That's awesome. You don't do good deeds, though, so people can be like, that dude's awesome. You do them because it's the right thing to do. And so he just tells them, look, it may be hidden for now, but someday it's going to come out. Someday people are going to find out about all the good you've done, and just wait for that day. Because again, you're storing up your good deeds for heaven, not for earth. And so in all of these things that have been kind of crammed together, we're looking at a church full of human people. I'm sure if I asked, I'm not going to, raise your hand if you have struggled with one of these like 3 things. A lot of you would probably raise your hands, because I could say I've struggled with probably all 3 of them to some degree. Like, I've never been like, I drink all the time, but there's stuff, addictive, whatever, that I'm going to stop. So it's just not going well. But the next part seems like a huge departure, because it's like, oh, these first three things are so modern. And then the second part is like slavery. Does anyone in here own slaves? I didn't expect to see any hands. No, it's not a common thing. No one in the modern day here owns slaves. It's not a common thing. But by looking at this in the context of what slavery in Rome really was, this is actually one of the most helpful passages for modern day Christians, at least in my opinion. So I'm going to read it to you again. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters are not to show less respect for them because they are brothers. Instead, they are to serve them even better, because those who benefit from their service are believers and dear to them. These are the things you are to teach and urge on them. It seems kind of wrong if you put that in the overall context of pre-Civil War American slavery, which I think everyone in this room would agree was horrible. Like probably one of the most objectionable things this country has ever done. Out and out. Not great. But if we really look back, and I'm going to give you guys a little history lesson on ancient Civ slavery, which is such a weird thing to talk about on a Sunday morning, but it's important to understand the context. And part of that context involves this cup. I will tell you how at the end of my lesson, so you can't just leave. Keeping you here captive because you want to know what's up with the cup. So, as I've already said, I teach, and my jam, the thing I've devoted the last decade or so of my life to, is ancient world civilizations, from the dawn of man to Christopher Columbus discovering America. So, the whole part where the Bible took place, and after, and before. So, well, not before, So, slavery, though, has worn a lot of different faces over that time period. So if we start all the way back, beginning of the Bible, the people of Israel being enslaved by the Assyrians, that is the perfect picture of what the original face of slavery was. You would go to war with someone, you would lose, they would take over your country, and you would either just be there you just keep working the land and you're going to give us the stuff from it, or we're going to send you somewhere else to work for them. That's how a lot of them ended up in Egypt. So slavery was just a post-war management system. It wasn't we're going to capture you because we can. It's we need this land, we're going to take it. We do, we ship you off. And it stays much like that for about 1,000 years. Eventually we'll get to the point where yes, there is kidnapping, which the Old Testament condemns. There are also other forms of I am too far in debt myself, so I'm going to sell myself into slavery and work my debt off. I'm saying this because it's wrong, but parents used to sell their children into slavery to get rid of debts. None of you can do that. Those of you with children, you cannot sell them into slavery no matter how much you want to or how old they are, but that was a thing. So there are all these different ways to be enslaved or to take slaves, and in Rome, it was very much the same. Roman slavery was, you were either taken through warfare, it was because of debt, and one of the other ways was it was a prison sentence. No one wanted to work in the mines because it was ridiculously dangerous. So it's oh, you killed 37 horses, you are now enslaved, you have to go work in the hole in the ground. That's it. And so it wasn't the buying and selling we think it is when you think slavery in the Americas, because that was we pick them up, we move them over, we sell them, and it's just a life of absolute servitude. I'm not going to say it was all sunshine and roses in Rome, because it wasn't. At some points, the average life expectancy of a slave was 17 years old. At others, slaves lived long enough that at the age of 30, it was customary to free them. It's oh, you've turned 30, you're free, go ahead. And when they were freed, throughout all of Roman history, they were given partial citizenship. They could vote as long as their master acted as a patron who taught them how politics worked. Later, it was actually made that if you were enslaved and you had a child, that child was automatically a full citizen of Rome with all rights given to them. And most slaves in Rome were Italian, because they're like, we're going to conquer the outlying lands, we're going to bring these people in. So if we were to take this church and move it back to Rome, we could probably cut it down the middle, and it would be about half free, half slave, and we would look about like this, because there was no race component to it like there was in the Americas. And slaves weren't forced into like the lowest class. They were, you could go to a doctor who was a slave. If you had to go to court, your lawyer might be a slave. Nowadays, we call them public defenders. No one laughed at that at Rockport either. I worked on that one forever. But still, slaves could do all parts of life. They could control property, but it technically belonged to the people who owned them. But slavery was a much more kind of transient thing back then. Slaves could be in all parts of society. They could do good jobs, they could do poor jobs. It just kind of depended on who you were as a person and how much, you were capable of. And so when we look at what it says here, we're not talking when you think slavery, or you think even slavery in the film Spartacus, where they're all in chains being led by big burly men on horses. It was just people with a specific cultural title. And the big thing that to me really separates ancient civ slavery from modern world slavery is the cup. Where'd the cup go? Cup. So, who here has ever heard the name Caesar Augustus? All right, more hands this time. I got 2 at Rockport. Caesar Augustus is also not the tiny pizza guy. Different Caesar. Caesar Augustus, though, was the leader of all of Rome at the time of Jesus' birth. When Augustus died, it was taken over by Tiberius, who was the Caesar through the end of Jesus' life. And after that, we got Caligula, and that's when things just went completely insane. But Augustus is actually held up historically as one of the most right, moral leaders in all of human history. And part of it comes from a cup. There was a guy who was kind of a big deal in Rome, who was known throughout the land as being an absolute monster to his slaves. He actually had his mansion built where in the back there was a pool of water in which lived about 100 sea lampreys. Who's familiar with a sea lamprey? It's like an angry underwater snake that just has a mouthful of teeth. It doesn't even have a face. They're horrifying. And his punishment, if slaves disobeyed him, was he would throw them in and have them eaten, which is horrible. And people knew this, and no one wanted to go there. But he invited Caesar to a dinner. And so Caesar's sitting there, and one of the slaves walks out with a fancy soup cup, and he drops it, and it shatters. And the guy who owned the mansion was like, well, that's unacceptable. How dare you take him to the lamprey hole? And Caesar was like, hold on. What are you doing? He's like, well, I'm going to have him killed for breaking that cup. And Caesar did 3 things. First thing he did was he told everyone to stop. He's like, no, this isn't happening. And he interfered directly with how this man was treating his slaves, which if you looked at pre-Civil War American slavery, no president would ever step in directly like that. It just didn't happen because there was such a different mindset. The second thing that Augustus did was he immediately freed the slave. He's like, you're free. You are out from under the thumb of this guy. He's a psychopath. And then in perhaps my favorite moment of abuse of emperor power, Augustus told all of his guards to rise, walk into the kitchen, and break the rest of the guy's cups. Which is hilarious, but it really proved a point of he's like, you're going to put a cup above the life of one man. How dare you? And so he even then said, look, just because they're enslaved doesn't mean we can treat them poorly. And that shows to me the very ideal of what this is saying here. Slaves were not lesser people, they were just at different parts of society. And as Christians, to put it in today's context, we're in a weird societal place. I was talking to my wife about this. Because as Christians, we're simultaneously held up as as Christians, they need to be these moral, upstanding, righteous, perfect human beings. And yet, oftentimes they're Christians are horrible, what's the word? hypocritical, like whatever. And you see it, like if you go online and you look up stuff about Christians, if you look at like modern media, there's a lot of like double talk about Christianity of how like, oh, we're the best and we're the worst. And it's not right. But societally, we have an obligation that is spoken about in here with how we deal with slaves. I'm going to read you a passage out of Ephesians that is basically the same passage with one more part. So this is Ephesians 6:9. Well, it's 5 through 9. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that it is he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So in this, we get a very direct idea of how Christians, both as slave, bottom of the societal ladder, and master, top of the societal ladder, are to behave towards each other and even non-brothers in Christ. We are to treat them with the love and reverence that we would give anyone else at any time, and perhaps even better so. I'm in an interesting position because I was raised in the church, and so I've lived my whole life. Like, I didn't go, like, I never went like wild and like left the church. Like, the worst thing I did in high school was I told my parents, I'm going to the library, and I would go to the library, but I'd stop at Family Video and rent R-rated horror movies that I was allowed to watch. They just didn't like that I did, so I wasn't even breaking the rules. That was as wild as I got. But, as a friend of mine put it, you wouldn't look at me and think like, oh, that guy is a strong, devout Christian. You're more like, I think that guy eats puppies, because he's scary looking. And so, people will look at me, and they'll consider like, oh, this guy's, maybe not the top shelf of society. I go shopping in Lima a lot. I went shopping in Lima a lot when I was in college, and that was back before, I did my hair every day and bathed regularly. So I was a bit of a dumpster fire of a human being. And one day I'm walking into this discount store I go to, and this guy comes up to me, and he's like, hey man, I just want you to have this. Shook my hand and then said, have a great day, and just walked away. That was it. And I looked down, and in my hand, he'd put a little blue religious tract that on the back had his church's address and times of services. And he just smiled, walked away, got in his truck with his 2 sons, and drove off. And I'm like, that's how you minister to people. And I'm like, if I wasn't like a youth director somewhere, I might go to this guy's church. Because to me, I'm like, that's how you do it. He was super polite. It was probably a $40,000 pickup truck he was driving, and he was wearing like all name brand, but it didn't matter that he was coming up to a semi-washed, grungy-looking college student. He treated me like I was anybody else. And that really showed me like it was this. He's like, oh, I'm going to speak to you on your level. I'm going to treat you like a brother. Whereas in another situation, I wasn't sure this morning if I was going to share this story, but I'm going to because it illustrates the point. I had a substitute come into my classroom this last year at school, and I was always kind of told, like, you make your classroom your own. So I have up all like my social studies posters, but I also have up some personal stuff. I have some band posters for like the rock bands I like. I have an X-Files poster. I have a big Jolly Roger behind my desk, which is funny that later got me in trouble. I'm not bad-mouthing pirates. Like, am I safe? No. Am I good? We good? Okay. And just all this stuff in my classroom that really, it kind of identifies who I am. I like the color black. I listen to a lot of heavy metal. It's whatever. And so my kids come in and they're like, okay, we know who this guy is. And they'll ask me like, oh, what's this band? I'm like, oh, it's like this band that you already listened to, whatever. And so this sub comes in and we talk for maybe 30 seconds. I'm just like, here's the materials, here's the plan. She's like, okay, cool. And I leave. And I come back on Monday to an email from my principal that was just titled, "Just So You Know." And I open it up, and it's a Facebook screenshot. This woman had gone around my classroom and taken pictures of stuff on my desk, of some of the stuff I have on my walls, of my classroom, and posted them on Facebook with a lengthy series of paragraphs calling me an enemy of God and a force for Satan in the schools. Because there's no way a Christian person could have heavy metal posters or any of this stuff. And it wrecked me for like 2 weeks. Because later that day, I'm like, oh man, and the principal came talking to me, he's like, look, don't change anything, just, I want you to be aware that that's what happened in case someone comes back to you. And the woman who sent the screenshots to him and then to me also sent me the comments. And the comments were probably harder to read because these are adults, most of them older than I am, in better financial places and all this stuff, who are then commenting on this woman's pictures. And I can tell you right now, not a single one of them said that they should pray for me. All of them were saying like, oh, this person's horrible. Hopefully he doesn't affect the kids negatively. This is awful. This guy should be fired. And I'm like, as Christians, shouldn't you be maybe like, have you reached out to this person? Have you gone to this person who you see as perhaps lesser than you are and said like, hey, are you familiar with Christ? No one even talked to me about it. Well, no one from there talked to me about it. And I was conflicted. I sat at my computer. I found her on Facebook. I pulled up the Messenger tab and I had her sitting there. And I'm like, what do you even say? How do you talk to this person and be like, look, we are equals in the eyes of God here. Even if I wasn't a devout Christian, like party foul. And I ended up not sending anything. Because the only thing I could think to send was like me trying to defend myself, which just seemed guilty. And so I just kind of grin and like bore it. But that really showed to me like, as Christians, how often do we get caught up as like, well, look at where I am in society, and therefore all Christians are on the same level that I am. And never once do we think, maybe we should lower down a little bit. We should look down. Like, I am awed by the people I see on Facebook who, they don't comment themselves, but I see people commenting back on their stuff about like, hey, I heard about these missions you're doing. I heard that you're inviting people into your private homes for dinner and to be ministered to. People who go out and work without any fanfare with drug addicts, with like victims of violence, all this stuff, who like, to me, I'm like, I never even thought of doing that. I don't think I'm the right person to do so. But these people are like, it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter on what level of society. Free, slave, rich, poor. We're all equal in the eyes of Christ. And so they're reaching up to these people. They're reaching down to these people. And that is the very idea that we're getting at here. At no point should we put our stuff, ourselves, our credentials above other Christians or even non-believers. Because the Bible even says here, no matter what level of society they're on, we are all kindred. And that's something that I really want you to take with you this week and ask yourself when you're walking around, are there any people that I'm not seeing, that I'm not reaching out to? Or perhaps are there people who are pushing me down, have their thumb in my back, who I can witness to through good service? Or are there people who maybe, I found myself doing this, that I'm thumbing down. I'm like, oh, no, you stay over there. And I'm keeping myself like, I'm a pure, upstanding individual who will have nothing to do with this. And I catch myself doing it. And I'm ashamed of myself, but it's one of those self-reflective moments where I'm like, I need to fix this. Because this isn't where Christ wants me to be. He wants me to be down there with them. Like, bring it in. So, think this week. Who can you reach to? What cups can you break to bring the body of Christ closer together? Please join me in prayer. Thank you, Lord, for bringing us all together today. Please be with everyone who couldn't be here and give them traveling mercies wherever they're at. And Lord, just be with us to see the unseen, to deal with those who maybe we haven't taken the time to notice, and to put ourselves on the level of, up or down. And just be with us as we take this message into our week, Lord, and help us to be a light for you. It's in your gracious name I pray. Amen.